Now, next on my list of topics to talk about, as they are many, is his discussion on the dying and rising gods. This is a pretty big topic because Bart Ehrman in particular regularly claims that there weren't any dying and rising gods, or at least there wasn't like a Mytheme.
About dying and rising gods, there's this idea that there were Mesopotamian deities and other gods at the time. There was this idea that with the seasons they would die and then rise again, and that potentially Jesus was just kind of a copy pasting or a Jewish version of this notion, this idea of dying and rising deities.
Yeah, that's another one that's really overplayed. If you actually read these stories, first of all, you never have a human being who dies and comes back to life. Jesus in the Gospels is portrayed as a human being who comes back to life. He's raised from the dead, and that's not Dionysus. The gods who die, they're not gods who come back to earth. For some reason, I don't know why, but every time I talk about this, just mythicists don't believe me. But I mean, I think the best book that deals with this is one of the great historians of religion of the 20th century, who's not a Christian, but he was a historian of Christianity as one of his many, many things, Jonathan Z. Smith. Jonathan Z. Smith looks at all this material on dying and rising gods, and he shows that either they never die, or if they die, they don't rise. And so if somebody really is interested, they should look at what Smith says and go into it. There may be some instances in ancient Near East and some kind of bizarre instances many hundreds of years before Jesus of a god who dies and comes back. It's not a prominent theme in Greek and Roman religion. I don't know of a definitive case in Greek and Roman religion, let alone one before Jesus that he's modeled on. Because what happens to Jesus is not at all what happens with the dying and rising. He's not a fertility god. Jesus doesn't make your corn grow.
I know, he keeps saying that. And this is very embarrassing of him to keep doing this. Because it just repeatedly shows that he is not doing any research on this. He's not reading any of the literature. And in fact, it's even more embarrassing than that, because he cites Jonathan Z. Smith in the interview, and he makes claims. He says, and quote unquote, Jonathan Z. Smith looks at all this material. False. Jonathan Z. Smith, his entire book, Drudgery Divine, only examines one specific claim about one specific God claims. It's one thing to do, one particular religious claim about Dionysus, and that's all he does. Dionysus / Zagreus, this so-called construct myth. And he only examines the modern scholarly reconstruction of the Zagreus myth. That's based, and it relates to Dionysus and so on. But that's all Jonathan Z. Smith does. There is zero material in Smith's book about any of the other dying and rising gods, at least that relates to evidence regarding them. And yet Ehrman says he looks at all this material and refutes that there aren't any dying and rising gods. That is not in Smith. Now, Smith might claim that. I know, like outside his book and possibly in his book, he makes that claim. But the book never addresses this. It never shows that this is true, because he only examines one claim. The Z. Smith book is all about one claim only. But the relevant point here is that Ehrman doesn't know that, right? So that means he has not even read Jonathan Z. Smith. He's just quoting Jonathan Z. Smith, or citing Jonathan Z. Smith in defense of Ehrman's belief that there are no dying and rising gods. There's no evidence for this. I mean, this is coming from anyone else. This would be evidence of amateurism, right? This would be a complete incompetence. There's no professional ethical reason why Ehrman should be doing this. He should know, first of all, don't cite the book if you haven't read it. 2, get correct what's in the book. 3, don't say things are in the book that aren't in the book. And 4, most importantly, actually check the stuff. Don't just listen to Jonathan Z. Smith. Oh, I heard him in a talk one time make this statement in one sentence. That is not scholarship. That is the opposite of that's just reporting on scholarship. If you want to do scholarship, Bart Ehrman, if you want to be a scholar, you have to check the facts yourself. And I've provided ample citations of direct evidence, for textual evidence, archaeological evidence, and so on. I've cited scholarship on this. There's no excuse for him, none whatsoever anymore, to continue making these false claims. And I'll give you an example of one of these. He says, no humans die and come back to life, quote unquote. Well, Romulus, Zalmoxis, Osiris, Dionysus, they're all humans. They're all demigods. Well, Zalmoxis is just an ordinary guy. Romulus is an incarnate demigod, but so is Jesus, right? So Jesus isn't a human either, by the way. He's a demigod. So it's already a false analogy, right? It's not like, look at the nativity narratives, or even if you look, and he even mentions, or he doesn't mention in this video, but he has mentioned elsewhere that he now agrees that the first Christians, believers after the death of Jesus, believe that Jesus was an incarnate, pre-existent celestial being. So that he actually is a divine being, even while he was walking around on earth. That was a Christian belief before even Mark wrote his gospel. Mm-hmm. So Ehrman believes this. He didn't. There was a time when he didn't, but he now agrees that this is the fact, which is an example of what I've noticed about Ehrman, is that he attacked me for taking this position, and I attacked him for saying, dude, there's a whole peer-reviewed literature on this. What are you talking about? I didn't just make this up. And then suddenly, a couple years later, oh gosh, he actually decides to look into this question and discovers, he's surprised. Oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of peer-reviewed literature that makes this argument. Oh my gosh, they have good arguments. I agree with them. And I'm like, yeah, thanks. An apology would be nice. No, he'll never acknowledge that he attacked me for taking a position that he now agrees is well represented in the scholarship and that he agrees with. But that's what he did. He didn't check, right? When he was attacking me, he didn't check. And then for some other reason, he was doing research for a book and he decided to check. And golly, look what he found. He found that he was wrong all along and I was right. And that the scholarship, there's tons of peer-reviewed scholarship that establishes this. The evidence is strong, and he agrees with it and lays it out in his book, How Did Jesus Become God? And so that's annoying, but that's what he does, right? He just makes these assertions until he gets a bug up his ass and decides to actually check. And usually when that happens, it doesn't support what he was arguing before. But this is an example of that. He's not checking. There are tons of humans who are humans in every sense that Jesus is believed to have been, who die and rise from the dead. He says that there are no gods who return to earth after rising from the dead. I'll point out, neither did Jesus originally. Jesus doesn't return to earth in Paul. He appears celestially, right, in Revelations. So there's no return to earth. That's a gospel invention. The gospels invent the idea of Jesus walking around on earth after his death. And guess where they get that story? They get that story from other pagan deities and heroes who did exactly the same thing, including Osiris, Zalmoxis, Romulus, Dionysus. And this is scholarly conjecture. There's direct textual evidence for this. It's not, and pre-Christian at that. He makes a whole point about how these things changed over time, and so you can't use later evidence. I said, no, we have pre-Christian evidence, dude. How do you not know that we have pre-Christian evidence? It frustrates the hell out of me that he just won't fact check this stuff. And so he just blurts out false statement after false statement after false statement with total confidence, basically deceiving the audience into giving them the impression that he's checked these things when he hasn't, and he's just wrong. And I don't understand how you can maintain respectability and act like that as a scholar.
But what's typically done is they require hyper-specific criteria for like the whole dying and rising God thing. Yeah.
He didn't make that argument in this interview, so I'll give him credit for that. But no, he made the worse argument, which was no, they don't come back to Earth at all. No, they don't. There's no human died or rose at all. Like it's even worse. It's like a blanket statement. He doesn't say like, well, yeah, there are some examples, but they don't exactly fit. Which we agree with. None of us peer-reviewed mythicists claim that there's an exact fit. We don't claim that Jesus is Osiris 2.0. In fact, that's an exact statement in my book. Jesus is not Osiris 2.0. That's almost verbatim from the book. But I just know what you're talking about. Let me just list some of the quotes I got. He says about the mystery religions and about dying and rising gods, they don't know any of the details. False, meaning scholars don't know any of the details. We have tons of details. There was capital punishment if you were to reveal the details. Therefore, that's why we don't have any details. That's false. Under the Roman Empire, when the time that's relevant, and even after classical Athens, there was not capital after classical Athens. There was not capital punishment for revealing the truths. And in fact, Hippolytus, one of the Christian great heresiologists of the early 3rd century, wrote 2 whole chapters, 2 whole volumes on the contents of the mystery religions. But those books were destroyed. The medieval Christians tore them out of his multi-volume work, and they're lost. But he had enough material to write 2 whole volumes on them, right? And we have tons of references. We have inscriptions. We have archaeological evidence. We have tons of references. We've got Apuleius wrote a whole religious novel about the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. He goes through the entire induction ceremony, the secret mysteries of Isis that he went through. He refers to there being even more advanced mysteries of Osiris that he hadn't gone through yet. But we have a whole narrative of it. So like we have tons and tons of evidence. Meyer, like I said, him alone has hundreds of pages of material, and that's just a drop in the bucket of what we've got. But no, what does Ehrman says? We don't have any information about these religions. That is a direct quote. That's wildly false. Why is he making these statements? Gods who die are not gods who come back to earth. False. As I note, neither does Jesus, but never mind. Originally, only the Gospels do that. But where do the Gospels get that idea? Like I said, they get the myths of returning gods, resurrected gods. Romulus is a classic example. The Emmaus narrative is clearly a transvaluation of the Romulus narrative. And this is also peer-reviewed literature. Richard Miller has written a whole book on this, but many other scholars have done so. There's a lot of peer-reviewed literature on this. And then the humans thing. No humans die and come back to life. That's false. It's not even true of Jesus, but anyway. But yeah, so the mystery cult stuff is just garbage. Like he just literally does not know what he's talking about, and has made, after years of being criticized for this, has made no effort to know what he's talking about. Like he hasn't done any of the work on this, and I just don't understand how a scholar of his prestige and level can act like that. I know I said that before, but I just, case after case after case, this keeps happening, and I don't understand it. Like it doesn't make sense to me. Like even, I don't know. I just can't explain why he acts like this, and it doesn't make sense for him to do so. And it's repetitious. So we can move on to another topic, but I think that's the general gist that I got out of this whole interview.
The one thing that I was thinking about earlier was syncretism. They often don't understand what it means to syncretize one religion with another religion, because they always I hear this from a lot of people. It's like, oh, well, this Jesus is not exactly like Osiris, and is not exactly like these other things. And they don't realize that it's the differences that actually are the important part.
Right. And syncretism doesn't work the way the amateur internet, I conflated the two words, internet and amateur. Amateur internet mythicists will argue is that, this is an exact copy. That is not what actually happens. That's not what happens in any religion. What they do is they borrow elements and then they alter them and integrate them with what came before. So Judaism, when it borrowed Zoroastrianism, it wasn't just Zoroastrianism 2.0. They borrowed a few ideas, integrated them into the Judaism that they had, and altered those ideas to fit. So the ideas are changed. They're in a different context. But that doesn't mean that they didn't borrow those ideas. I mean, chronologically, it's obvious they did, because none of these Zoroastrian beliefs that are in Judaism were in it before their contact with Persia, and then suddenly after their contact with Persia, they start showing up. And that's the general resurrection, apocalyptic history, Satan's war with God, it's all of those things, even a flaming hell, which not all Jews believed in, but it was at least there were some people advocating. But the idea of the earth being melted and sinners all being burned up comes from Zoroastrianism. That was not an original. You don't find that in pre-Persian influence Israelite religion.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because another thing that's commonly done is that they think that everything about Jesus has to come from one source, or everything has to come from Zoroastrianism in order for there to be some kind of connection there. They don't really understand the link between the scriptures as well as other influences other than Zoroastrianism.
Yeah, and how they get combined into a new thing. I don't want to go on to this too much, because I don't want to give the impression that Ehrman in this interview made any of those arguments. He did not. So we're criticizing a general criticism that exists out there, but it's not one that was in this video.
Was there anything else that you wanted to say on the mystery religions?
I think I said enough. For people who want to see that, I wrote a blog. Well, actually, you could get it in my book, Jesus from Outer Space. I have a blog article on dying and rising gods, but in my book, Jesus from Outer Space, I have it too. But if you go to the blog, that has the references that you can get. So you can actually see the actual stories, the firsthand texts, the evidence we have, how it actually works out. And these points that we made just now are also made there. So if you want to see how a scholar who's actually researched this stuff and actually knows what he's talking about gets to the conclusion on these things, go read my blog on it. That sort of summarizes how I got to the position that I am and all the research I did to get there, and why I take the position that I do. It's based on not just all the research relating to the dying and rising gods that actually exists. There's tons of evidence, tons of scholarship, but also on religious history generally. So you mentioned syncretism as a phenomenon. You cannot talk competently about the origins of Christianity if you do not understand syncretism as a religious phenomenon. So you have to understand the anthropology of religion, the history of religions. You have to know these things. You've got to know the context of human history of religion to know what syncretism is and how it works, and to look at other examples of how it's worked. And the flood myths, for example, how they evolve and change and get adopted by other cultures and altered. We have tons of examples outside Christianity of how syncretism operates. So there's no excuse to claim that you don't know. Like, no, we have tons of scholarship on this. Go find out. And then you'll understand how to look at the evidence for Christianity, because you will do it from the eyesight that is informed with the background evidence of how religions evolve and change and how new religions start. You got to study the whole science, the whole context of how new religions start, particularly in the ancient world, particularly how ancient literature gets produced. I have a whole big thing I'm going to go on probably in my blog about this, about how Ehrman's complete flabbergasting ignorance of how ancient education and literature operated. It comes very clear in this video, and it's shocking. There's no excuse for it at this point in this debate with him. He's been told over and over again which authors to read, where to go and understand how ancient education taught authors to write, how authors compose stories. He should know this by now. He wrote a whole book on forgery. There's no excuse how could he do that and not know any of this stuff. I just don't understand it. And by the way, his book on forgery is excellent, especially the peer-reviewed version, the forgery and counter-forgery. The pop market version is good too, but if you want the real scholarly version with the footnotes and the bibliography and everything, forgery and counter-forgery is a really good work of scholarship. So he has the skills. He knows how to apply them. There's no excuse for him to not do it. And it's not because he's an amateur. It's because he just chooses to not act like a professional when it comes to this issue. And I can't explain it.